Hi everyone. In part 8, we will shift from the black letter provisions to the political discussions around the AI Act.
The goal is not to pick a side, but to understand the main fault lines. How the AI Act allocates power, what it treats as an AI harm, and where governance choices determine what compliance means in practice.
Why do political discussions matter in a course about regulation?
Because the AI Act is not only technical, it sets defaults that shape markets and public administration, and it decides which harms become legible as regulatory problems. These debates matter for implementation. The same legal text can produce very different outcomes depending on how authorities interpret scope, how standards translate requirements, and how enforcement priorities develop.
A first fault line is the definition of AI.
The AI Act defines an AI system broadly as a machine-based system designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy, possible, adaptive after deployment that infers how to generate outputs such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions that influence physical or virtual environments. The critique isn't that broad coverage is always wrong, but that breadth can create strategic ambiguity. It's easy to claim wide coverage, but harder to draw stable boundaries in practice. That can lead to over-inclusion in some areas and under-inclusion in others, depending on enforcement incentives, sector pressure, and institutional capacity.
A second fault line is the Act's tendency to treat AI as a technical artifact rather than a socio-technical system.
Many harms are produced by deployment context, organizational incentives, procurement constraints, target metrics, staffing, supply chain, business models, and how output are embedded in decision workflows. If these factors are downplayed, compliance risks turning into box ticking, satisfying formal requirements without changing how systems actually shape people's lives. This matters especially for fundamental rights impacts, which are often cumulative and relational, not single-pointed failures you can fix with one technical patch.
Hello, my name is Jascha Bareis and I'm a postdoc at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. I'm also a co-founder of the Hype Studies Network. And I would like to share perspective on AI from the perspective of hype, because at the moment AI seems to be the most wanted thing circulating in society, as you maybe have realized. So looking at AI from the perspective of hype means looking how is it possible that at the moment a speculative trajectory of the future, which is very unlikely to happen, so that AI, for example, automates all labor, or AI is an existential threat to society, is getting so much societal attention. And I think you have to understand, when we look at the regulation of AI, we are also regulating an entity which is trying to get an answer to many crises which are now happening in society. Think about the crisis of politics at the moment. So we can see that there is a certain legitimacy crisis in many democratic governments, where values, liberal values like equality of opportunity, justice, distribution of wealth are not functioning well anymore. And as a politician, when you are associated with AI, you may be associated to a notion of a shiny and transformative future. And politicians want to be re-elected. And that's why we can see maybe so many AI strategy papers being published by governments. Or think about the crisis of economy. And capitalist ideas and ideologies in economy needs to grow. But at the moment, if you look at the OECD, on the average, our economies are hardly growing anymore. And hype around AI promises that there is a trajectory of accelerating growth, of automation of labor, which is very shiny and promising, not trying to escape out of the crisis of capitalism. And think about the crisis of information. So at the moment, it seems that when we look at media, entertainment seems ever more impactful than the truth. And hype around AI is actually doing this. It's entertaining a future which is very speculative and cannot be disproven. When we talk about AGI, when we talk about huge trajectories of growth, it's a very nice escapism to not talk about the crisis we are right now confronting in our society. So this is why AI regulation is so important. It is not only about the technology, it's about the question about who holds actually the power to decide on what kind of future we want to live in. Because think about it. Is it possible to think about the future which is not mediated through gadgets and through very shiny interfaces and through artificial intelligence? So I want to just make you sensitive that AI seems to be an answer to very structural problems we are now seeing in our society. And that's why the regulation of AI across platforms, across positions of power, across who gets to speak in public is so important.
Another major debate concerns the Act's dual structure. It borrows heavily from product safety and conformity assessment logic, while also claiming fundamental rights protection as a central goal.
The misfit critique is that product safety tools work well for technical hazards that are stable and testable, but fundamental rights harms are contextual. They can depend on who is affected, how decisions are made, what alternatives exist, and whether contestation and remedy are real. The political worry is that rights become managed as technical risk variables rather than treated as democratically contestable commitments requiring participation, accountability, and remedy.
Governance is the next fault line. Who actually holds the pen over what compliance means?
The AI Act creates a multi-level governance landscape with EU coordination bodies, national competent authorities, namely the market surveillance authorities and the notifying authorities, notified bodies and standard setters.
That complexity can create fragmentation.
Politically, the risk is distributed accountability. When many actors each control a piece of the compliance pipeline, it becomes harder to locate responsibility when harms occur or when enforcement is weak.
Standards are a particularly sensitive governance lever.
The AI Act relies on harmonized standards to operationalize legal duties and provides for common specifications when standards are missing or inadequate. The critique is private standardization without democratic supervision. Standards can become quasi-law in practice because meeting the standard can become the de facto definition of lawful AI under the AI Act, especially when regulators and companies treat standards as the easiest evidence pathway.
This creates agenda-setting power. Decision about what is measurable, what is state-of-the-art, and which trade-offs are acceptable may shift toward expert and industry focus area unless balanced participation and oversight safeguards are actively ensured.
Another recurring critique is missing participation of affected subjects. The people most impacted by AI systems often have limited leverage over risk identification, design trade-offs, post-deployment monitoring, and remedy. Even when consultation exists, it can become consultation theater if there is no meaningful decision power or enforceable feedback loops. Politically, this ties back to what counts as AI harm.
If harm is defined mainly through provider-led risk management and technical documentation, these three impacts can remain invisible until crisis forces attention.
Algorithmic-based discrimination is a concrete example of this problem. Discrimination often shows up through proxies, intersectional effects, cumulative disadvantage, feedback loops, and differential access, not only over differential treatment. Enforcement can struggle when harms don't map neatly onto classic equality categories or when causality is diffuse. That makes auditing practice and governance design central.
Do documentation and oversight structures actually detect structural discrimination, or do they mainly validate procedural compliance?
Finally, lobbying and tech solutionism. The AI Act was developed under intense political pressure and debates continue in implementation. The concern is that obligations can be pushed towards more self-assessment, softer commitments, or narrow definitions that can reduce enforcement bite.
Tech solutionism is the broader critique, treating legitimacy as an engineering output, adding technical controls instead of grappling with power rights and governance.
At the same time, the Act does include meaningful enforcement tools, including substantial penalties for certain infringements. The political question is how often those tools are used, against whom, and with what evidentiary standards.
To close this sequence, here's the overall map of what we have covered across parts 1 to 8, and the main thought line of what you should take away from this course.
Part 1 framed the why now of EU AI regulation. The AI Act is designed to harmonize rules across the internal market and to make trustworthy AI enforceable through concrete legal duties rather than voluntary ethics. The key point is that the Act treats AI governance as a public interest and constitutional issue, not merely a technical quality issue.
Part 2 establishes the scope logic, what counts as an AI system and what does not, who is regulated across the value chain, and how the Act uses market placement and extraterritorial reach to ensure the rules apply whenever AI systems are placed on the EU market or used in ways that affect people in the EU.
Part 3 introduced the risk-based architecture of the AI Act, prohibited practices, limited risk transparency duties, and the high-risk regulatory regime. Risk is the organizing principle because the Act is designed to scale obligations to the level of potential harm to health, safety, and fundamental rights. This part gave you the classification logic you need to navigate the Act. First, classify the system or model, then identify the triggered obligations.
Part 4 translated high risk into operational compliance, core duties around data governance, documentation, logging, robustness, and cybersecurity, transparency requirements that make appropriate use possible, human oversight as a bundle of actual capabilities and authority, not a symbolic human in the loop, and responsibility allocation across actors, including Article 25.
Part 5 showed how the Act becomes enforceable. Governance architecture, the role of authorities, the dependence on standard and conformity assessments, and the market-style compliance logic.
Part 6 explained regulatory sandboxes as a support and learning mechanism, why they exist, what they enable, and the practical constraints that keep them from becoming deregulated free zones.
Part 7 introduced model layer governance for general purpose AI, baseline obligations for GPAI model providers, how those obligations differ from downstream system obligations, and why systemic risk triggers a stricter second track with evaluation, risk management, incident reporting, and security expectations.
Part 8 surfaced the political fault lines that will shape implementation, debates about the definition of AI, the risk of treating AI as purely technical rather than socio-technical, the tension between product safety style governance and fundamental rights protection, the power of standards and private standardization, participation gaps for affected communities, and the ever-present risk of lobbying and tech solutionism.
If you remember one sentence, the AI Act is a layered governance system that classifies AI by risk, assigns role-based duties across the value chain, demands auditable evidence of compliance, and relies on oversight institutions and standard to turn trustworthy AI from an aspiration into an enforceable practice. Thank you for watching.